Beneath a sky the color of old iron, the world of Krieg lay in ruin. Once its cities had glimmered like steel cathedrals in the light of its twin suns. Now those suns burned dim, their light struggling through the miasma of ash that clung to the planet's poisoned air. Towers that had once scraped the heavens were nothing but jagged silhouettes against a horizon of perpetual dusk. Oceans had turned to black, sluggish poison, rivers to veins of chemical filth. The air reeked of rad dust and the slow decay of a world that had destroyed itself. It was not an alien invasion that had brought Krieg low, nor a god's wrath from the warp. It was its own people, locked in a war of annihilation against themselves. They called it civil war, but it had been something far more absolute. Decades of bombardment had cracked the planet's crust, swallowing cities whole. Every horizon bore the bones of Krieg's past, the frames of manufactorums rusting in acidic fog, the crumbled shells of hab blocks where nothing living dared to breathe. The people who remained, if one could still call them people, were no longer citizens, no longer families. They were soldiers. Every child born in those years was raised not to live, but to endure until they could die in the Emperor's name. And yet, amidst the ruin, life endured. The surviving population had retreated underground, burrowing into the crust in a desperate bid for survival. Down in the bunker cities, lit by flickering lumen strips and echoing with the hum of filtration pumps, an entire generation was forged in the dark. These were the first seeds of what the galaxy would one day call the death cause of Krieg. Soldiers without fear, without mercy, and without hope. They wore their damnation as a second skin, born to inherit a war they had never chosen. From the heart of one such subterranean city came the man who would lead them through some of their bloodiest years. To his men, he was simply the Colonel. No name, no history worth speaking of, only duty. He had been raised in the shadows of the bunkers, taught the sacred catechisms of the Emperor and the art of killing in equal measure. His earliest memories were not of a family, but of drill squares, the taste of stale wreck rations, and the distant thunder of the surface wars. Like all on Krieg, he had been told the truth of their world early. They were a penitent people, and their only redemption lay in service unto death. On this day, he stood alone on the surface, his rebreather masking the metallic taste of the wind. Before him stretched the skeletal remains of the old capital, once the pride of Krieg's industry. Now it was a graveyard of twisted steel and glass, draped in the fine white ash of the dead. The Colonel knew the stories, how the ruling council had turned against the Emperor, seeking independence, and how loyalists had answered with total war. There had been no half measures. The planet had chosen to burn rather than unbend. The Colonel's gaze lingered on the horizon where the sun struggled to pierce the clouds. In its light, the ruins seemed almost alive, shifting in the heat haze like restless ghosts. He wondered if the planet could ever truly be redeemed, or if it was simply too far gone, a carcass animated only by the stubborn will of its dying people. Such thoughts were dangerous, almost heretical, but they clung to him nonetheless. For all his training, for all his loyalty, there was a hollow space in him where belief should have been. Behind him, the regiment waited in perfect formation, their greatcoats flapping in the dry wind, masks hiding all but the faint glimmer of their eyes. They would march soon, reclaiming another stretch of poisoned earth in the name of the Imperium. It was an endless war, fought in the mud and smoke, where the land itself seemed to resent being saved. And yet, this was their purpose. They were the Death Corps, inheritors of a sin they could never wash away, fighting a penance they could never finish. For a moment, the colonel allowed himself the smallest indulgence, the thought of peace, not the peace of victory, for he knew that was a fantasy, but the peace of laying down one's arms, of no longer hearing the whistle of shells in the night. He wondered if such a thing existed anywhere in the galaxy, or if every world was, in its own way, a trench. He turned, his voice muffled by the mask, as he gave the order to advance. The regiment moved as one, boots crunching on the brittle ground, rifles held at the ready. The ruins of the capital faded into the haze behind them, swallowed once more by dust and memory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, more enemies waited, human, Xenos, or perhaps even the remnants of Krieg's own betrayal. It did not matter. We tell this story because we have walked with them through the mud, the cold, and the endless bombardments. We know what it is to stare into the void and find it staring back. And we tell it because, for all their flaws, the death cores were ours. They were born for war, and in their war, we see ourselves. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. The march had begun, and with it, the long road into darkness. The bunker city's walls sweated with condensation, the stale air heavy with the scent of oil, metal, and too many bodies packed into too little space. Beneath the surface of Krieg, entire generations had lived and died without ever feeling the kiss of wind on their skin. Here, the world was an endless maze of corridors, barracks, mess halls, and training yards carved into the stone. In these cold tunnels, the Emperor's word was drilled into every waking moment, as constant as the air recyclers that hummed overhead. Childhood was a brief, regimented prelude to enlistment. By the age of 12, a boy or girl could strip and reassemble a Lazraful in them, dark, and by 16, they would already have a number stitched into their greatcoat, their name replaced by duty. The colonel remembered those early years, not with fondness, but with the kind of detached clarity that comes from looking at an old scar. His instructors had been shadows in heavy greatcoats, voices muffled by rebreathers. Faces meant nothing, only orders mattered. Sleep came on narrow bunks under the low glow of lumen strips. Waking meant another day of drills, weapons practice, lectures on loyalty, and the recitation of the catechism of penance. There was no room for dreams, save for one, to serve on the surface, to earn the right to fight and die for Krieg's redemption. He would often steal moments of stillness in the hydroponic halls, where pale crops grew under artificial light, fed by the city's recycled water. Here, the air was cleaner, and for a time he could pretend that Krieg might one day be green again. But those moments never lasted. The overseers always found them, dragging him back to the yards where the crack of lasfire drills echoed endlessly. Even then, some part of him knew that the greenery above would never return, that the planet's wounds were too deep to heal. Yet he clung to the thought all the same. Perhaps it was weakness. Perhaps it was all that kept him human. It was during those formative years that he met the boy who would later become both ally and rival. They were paired in training exercises, matched for similar skill, and though they never spoke of family, such things were not spoken of on Krieg. There was a bond in the way they moved as one in the mock battles. The boy's eyes, cold and sharp even then, seemed to burn with a hunger the colonel did not yet understand. They both passed every trial, endured every punishment without complaint, and when they graduated to full soldiers, they stood side by side in the parade ground as the banners of the death cause were unfurled. The years that followed blurred into one another, measured in deployments and body counts. Life in the bunker cities prepared them well, but the surface was a harsher teacher. Outside the shelter of stone and steel, the air was sharp with radiation and grit, the ground a broken plain where nothing grew. Trench lines stretched for kilometers in every direction, dotted with shattered bastions and rusting tank husks. The colonel learned quickly that the war did not pause for exhaustion or doubt. You fought or you died. And when you died, another took your place without ceremony. But beneath the discipline, there was always the undercurrent of the world's great lie, that every soldier fought for redemption. The colonel began to suspect that the war was not truly about reclaiming the surface or rebuilding the cities. No one spoke of peace. No one planned for it. The war itself had become the point, the unending ritual that kept the people of Krieg bound together in shared damnation. Those who dared speak otherwise simply vanished, their bunks reassigned before dawn. One night, deep in the barracks, the rival, now an officer in his own right, found the colonel staring at an old map of Krieg's pre-war cities. "You keep looking at ghosts," the rival had said, his voice flat behind his mask. "They won't come back, and neither will we." The words lingered long after the rival had gone, feeding a question the colonel could not silence. If their lives were only payment for a sin committed long before they were born, what meaning did they truly hold? The next morning, orders came down. The regiment was to march to the upper levels, then breach the surface to reclaim a sector lost to the last radstorms. It was a routine assignment on paper, but nothing on Krieg was ever routine. The colonel stood with his men in the elevator cage as it rattled upwards, the stale air growing colder with each level passed. The familiar hum of the city's machines faded, replaced by the whispering silence of the outer layers. When the final gates opened, a blast of dry wind greeted them, carrying with it the stench of dust and old fire. Ahead lay the poisoned earth, lit by the faint, distant glow of the sun through the smog. The colonel stepped forward, his boots crunching on frost and ash. The men followed without hesitation. None spoke. There was nothing to say. Somewhere beyond the haze lay the ruins of a district that had once been home to tens of thousands. Now it was only another piece of the endless front. The colonel tightened his grip on his rifle. Whatever awaited them there, raiders, heretics, or only the slow death of exposure, it would be met in silence, as it always was. On Krieg, silence was the truest prayer. The march began, and the colonel did not look back at the safety of the bunker city. Safety was an illusion. The only truth lay ahead, in the wasteland, where every step forward was paid for in blood. The ascent from the bunker's lower levels to the poisoned surface was like rising from one grave into another. The elevator groaned with each passing tier, iron chains rattling in the dim glow of lumen strips. The regiment stood in perfect silence, masks hiding the set of their jaws, greatcoats swaying with the movement of the lift. The colonel kept his eyes fixed ahead, but he could feel the weight of his men's discipline pressing against the still air. They were ready to march, not because they hoped to win, but because they had never known any other truth. When the blast doors finally yawned open, the world above greeted them with its familiar, bitter welcome. A wind scoured across the landing platform, sharp with dust and the faint tang of radiation. The sky was a smear of copper and grey, the sun little more than a pale disk struggling through the clouds. The land beyond was a wasteland of cracked earth and fractured stone, a labyrinth of trenches and old fortifications clawing at the horizon. Somewhere out there lay their objective, a stretch of ground once fortified by loyalist forces, but abandoned after the last radstorms swept it clean of life. The colonel gave the order, and they began their march. Each step crunched against the brittle ground, the sound swallowed by the wind. The ruined world unfolded around them, revealing the scars of 1,000 forgotten battles. Tank husks, their hulls eaten away by decades of corrosion, lay half buried in the dust. Piles of rusted barbed wire sagged between splintered posts. Shell craters yawned like shallow graves. The colonel knew some of these scars had been here since the planet's civil war, when brother had turned on brother under the Emperor's gaze. Others were fresh, the work of recent skirmishes with warbands that prowled the wastes like carrion crows. By midday, they reached the first line of derelict fortifications. Here, the trenches ran deep and narrow, the walls crumbling inward with the weight of years. Faded imperial aquilus still clung to the stone in places, their outlines blurred beneath soot and grime. The colonel halted the column and scanned the horizon through his scope. The land seemed still, but stillness on Krieg was a deception. Danger never announced itself. He signaled the second platoon to clear the forward trench. It was during the sweep that the rival appeared, striding out of the haze with his own detachment. His greatcoat was immaculate despite the wind, his movements precise, calculated. The two officers exchanged a curt nod. No warmth, no greeting, just the acknowledgement of shared command. They had fought side by side before, though not always willingly. Once, in their youth, they had been inseparable in training, each measuring himself against the other. Now their relationship was defined by the unspoken knowledge that one would outlast the other, and that survival itself was its own kind of victory. "You're late," the rival said through the rasp of his rebreather. "Storms slowed us in the lower corridors," the colonel replied, his tone flat. The rival's eyes flicked to the men behind him, then back to the ruined trench line. "Command wants this sector cleared by nightfall. Reports of movement along the east flank, not locals. Could be scavengers. Could be worse." The colonel gave a short nod, but inside, the words stirred something colder than the wind. Scavengers were dangerous enough, desperate and unpredictable, but worse meant renegade Kriegborn, those who had turned from the Imperium's path, who rejected the endless war and chose survival over service. To face such enemies was to stare into a mirror that reflected what one might have been, had the Emperor's shadow not fallen so deep on one's soul. They pressed on together, their forces weaving through the broken trench system, clearing each segment in silence. It was in the fourth stretch that they found the first sign of opposition. A barricade of sandbags and scavenged plating, crudely erected across a choke point. Beyond it, faint shapes moved in the haze. The colonel signaled a halt. His men crouched low, weapons ready. The rival gestured sharply to his own troops, positioning them for a pincer assault. When the attack came, it was sudden and without warning. Figures in mismatched armor erupted from the haze, their weapons spitting red light through the dust. The air filled with the high-pitched whine of lasfire and the sharp cracks of stub guns. The colonel's regiment returned fire with practiced precision, cutting down the first wave before they could close. But more came, and soon the trenches were alive with the echoes of war. The colonel moved among his men, issuing orders, his voice steady. He caught glimpses of his rival on the opposite flank, leading his own charge over the barricade, bayonet flashing in the dim light. The fight was brutal and close, each kill marked by the hiss of scorched flesh or the dull thud of a blade finding its mark. By the time the last of the attackers fell, the trench was littered with bodies, some still twitching, others already cooling in the bitter air. When the dust settled, the colonel and his rival met again at the center of the line. Their eyes met over the rims of their masks, both knowing that the fight had been too small to be anything but a probing attack. Something else was out there, watching, waiting. The rival broke the silence. This sector will not hold without reinforcement. The colonel nodded once. Then we take the next trench before nightfall. The rival's gaze lingered a moment longer before he turned away, rallying his men. The colonel watched him go, the weight of the day settling into his bones. The march would continue, as it always did, until the land was taken or they were buried in it. The wind howled through the shattered fortifications as the regiment moved on, their silhouettes swallowed by the haze. Ahead, the next line of ruins waited, and beyond them, whatever enemy had sent the first wave. On Krieg, there was never a true victory, only the next battle. The next sector rose before them like a scar on the land, trenches zigzagging through crumbled buildings and half-collapsed manufactorums. The air was thick with dust and the faint stench of burned metal. The colonel led the regiment forward, every step measured, every eye scanning for the unexpected. They had learned over countless engagements that Krieg did not forgive mistakes, and the ground itself seemed eager to swallow those who faltered. The barricades of this sector had been hastily reinforced, remnants of an earlier defensive line, and the colonel's scouts reported movement just beyond the rubble. Not raiders this time, not scavengers, Krieg-born heretics, soldiers who had turned against the Emperor's mandate, choosing survival over penance. It was a rare confrontation, a clash with kin who had rejected the relentless march of death that defined the Death Corps. And yet, it was a confrontation the colonel had long anticipated. Orders were given quickly. Platoons flanked the enemy positions. Snipers took vantage points on the shattered roofs, and engineers prepared to breach the barricades with demolition charges. The colonel's rival moved to take the opposite flank, his troops a mirror of precision and discipline. Though they had not spoken since the skirmish on the previous sector, their coordinated movements betrayed a familiarity born of shared training and endless combat. Both men understood instinctively that success here required unity, however fragile. The first volley of last fire cut through the haze, bright beams lancing across the ruined streets, illuminating the skeletal remains of buildings and the pale faces of the enemy as they scrambled for cover. The colonel moved along the trench line, his eyes scanning for weak points, his voice steady as he issued commands. Men fell around him, but Krieg had taught them to treat death as a tool rather than a tragedy. Each loss was a step toward redemption, a payment for the sins of their ancestors. As the regiment pressed forward, the enemy retreated into the heart of the barricades, forcing the colonel to make a decision that would mark the day. He could order a direct assault, risking lives in a brutal frontal engagement, or he could attempt a flanking maneuver, which might split his forces and expose both flanks to counterattack. The rival officer met his gaze across the trench. In the brief moment of eye contact, neither spoke, yet each understood the other's thought. "Take the left flank," the colonel commanded finally, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "I'll engage the center." The rival's nod was almost imperceptible. In unison, the two regiments moved, the flanking platoon disappearing into the haze, while the colonel led a small force directly at the barricade. Charges were set, and the first explosions ripped through the enemy defenses, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. Smoke choked the trenches, masking the advance. But the enemy fought with desperation, knowing that capture would mean execution, or worse. In the chaos, the colonel caught sight of his rival struggling with a small squad of heretics attempting to break the flanking maneuver. A choice presented itself: leave the rival to his own devices, ensuring that the central assault held or divert his forces and risk compromising the main effort. His instincts screamed one path, loyalty another. He moved. With a sudden, calculated pivot, he surged toward the flanking engagement, cutting down enemies with precise shots, bayonet strikes, and the sheer momentum of authority. By the time the dust settled, the rival officer was alive, his troops intact though shaken, and the barricade had been breached. The colonel's gamble had succeeded, but at a cost. Several of his men had fallen in the crossfire, casualties that weighed heavily, even on a hardened mind. As silence fell once more, the colonel stood among the ruined barricades, breathing through his mask, scanning the horizon. The heretics had been defeated, but their presence was a reminder that Krieg's enemies were not only external. Within their own numbers, doubt, defiance, and the faintest hint of rebellion could fester if left unchecked. The colonel's rival approached, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. Not friendship, not gratitude, but a recognition that only survival and duty mattered here. The colonel's thoughts turned inward, away from the destruction around him. He knew the victory would be noted, perhaps even commended, but he could not ignore the nagging weight of the choices he had made. Saving his rival had been instinctual, perhaps even honorable, but the cost was not just measured in lives lost. It was measured in the slowly widening gap between purpose and morality, in the realization that on Krieg, survival often demanded the sacrifice of something deeper than flesh. Orders came again, signaling the next advance, the next trench line, the next confrontation. There would be no rest. The sun hung low in the ashen sky, a weak sentinel over a landscape shaped by centuries of penance and war. The colonel adjusted his grip on his weapon, motioned his men forward, and continued the march. Every step was both promise and penance. Every advance a reminder that on Krieg one was never merely alive, and never truly dead, only bound to the trenches in service to an emperor whose mercy was as distant as the suns that struggled to shine above. The message from the Imperial Commissariat arrived like a shadow over the regiment, carried by a small, austere shuttle that landed with deliberate precision in the shattered courtyard of the reclaimed sector. The colonel watched the craft descend, its polished hull a stark contrast to the ash and rust surrounding them. The men stood at attention, faces hidden behind masks, hands gripping rifles, the discipline of generations drilled into their posture. The air was cold, thick with the taste of metal and dust, and even the faint warmth of the weak sun above could not lift the oppressive weight that accompanied the commissar's presence. When the doors hissed open, a single figure emerged, clad in the iconic black greatcoat of the Imperial Commissariat, polished boots clicking on the broken stone. The colonel felt the shift immediately, the tension of absolute judgment pressing down on him, a weight he had known his entire life, but never truly felt until this moment. The commissar's eyes, cold and unyielding, behind the lenses of a rebreather, scanned the regiment with an imperious authority. Each man felt as if his soul was being measured against some impossible standard, the invisible scales of loyalty and obedience tilting with every heartbeat. The colonel stepped forward, his posture rigid as the commissar approached. The man's presence was a silent accusation, a reminder that on Krieg, survival did not equal absolution. The commissar's voice cut through the wind, muffled but sharp, reverberating in the colonel's mind with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Colonel," the voice began, "the Imperium has observed your actions in this sector. There are reports of insubordination, of delays that risked the success of the mission. You are to account for your decisions." For a heartbeat, the colonel considered silence, the refusal to dignify accusations that felt as old as the trenches themselves. But experience tempered instinct. He squared his shoulders and replied evenly, each word weighed, measured. Commissar, every step taken, every order executed, was in the service of the mission. Lives were preserved when possible, objectives met without compromise to the Emperor's will. The Commissar did not respond immediately, merely walking slowly among the troops, inspecting weapons, gear, even the alignment of the trench lines they had reclaimed. Each movement was deliberate, a subtle form of judgment that pierced deeper than any accusation. Finally, the Commissar stopped before the Colonel, voice quieter, more deliberate. Loyalty is measured not only in obedience, but in action. Yet even obedience without thought can lead to ruin. The Imperium requires not only soldiers, but judgment. The words hung between them like smoke, dense and suffocating. The Colonel felt the familiar hollow ache of uncertainty creeping in. He had been trained to follow orders, to march into fire and death without question. And yet, here was a reminder that the Imperium's definition of loyalty could shift with the winds of circumstance. To act too cautiously, to preserve life, could be construed as weakness. To act without thought could be treachery. There was no room for error, no margin for moral compromise. The Commissar turned slowly, surveying the regiment again, and the Colonel sensed the verdict had already been formed in that cold mind. "Your regiment survives," the Commissar finally said, voice ringing like steel against stone. "But remember, Colonel, the Emperor does not forgive negligence, and the Imperium does not forget. Fail again, and it will not be mercy you find in my judgment." With that, the Commissar departed, leaving the Colonel alone, amidst the men who looked to him for reassurance he did not entirely feel. The weight of command pressed on him with renewed intensity. Every decision he had made, every choice to save or sacrifice, now carried the invisible burden of scrutiny. The Colonel walked the lines of the trench, his eyes scanning faces beneath masks that hid exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. Each soldier moved with a disciplined precision born of training, yet he knew that even they could sense the fragility of their situation. The evening brought silence, broken only by the distant echoes of shell fire from other sectors and the faint moan of wind through shattered ruins. The Colonel allowed himself a moment to reflect, to consider what the Commissar's visit had truly meant. It was not merely a warning, it was a reminder of the larger machinery in which they were cogs, a machine that valued obedience above life and victory above humanity. He had saved lives in the previous engagement, yet he wondered if the Imperium truly valued those lives, or if they were simply another resource to be spent in the unending calculus of war. When night fell, the Colonel stood at the edge of the trench, looking across the desolate sector. The weak light of the dying sun cast long shadows across the ground, transforming broken earth and twisted metal into the shapes of ghosts. Somewhere in those shadows, enemies would stir, waiting for the inevitable march of the Death Corps. The Colonel tightened his grip on his rifle, the leather of his gloves creaking, and allowed himself the faintest acknowledgement of fear, not for himself nor for the enemy, but for the men under his command, whose lives depended on his judgment. The night deepened, carrying with it the scent of ash and the faint hum of distant machinery. The Colonel knew that sleep would be brief and rest a luxury. Orders would come again at dawn, and the regiment would march, fight, and die, in service to a world that had already condemned them. Yet even in the shadow of such inevitability, he felt the smallest flicker of resolve. They had survived today. They would survive tomorrow. And for Krieg, that was all that mattered. Not hope, not peace, but the unbroken line of steel and courage that stretched from the bunkers below to the trenches above. The frost-covered ruins of the next sector lay before the regiment like a jagged promise, broken stone and rusted metal, catching what little light the dying sun could cast through the ash-choked sky. The air was brittle, each breath burning through the filters of their masks, carrying the metallic tang of blood, dust, and decay. The colonel led his men forward, a motionless figure of authority. Every movement calculated, every glance measured. Krieg had taught them that hesitation was death, and so they advanced as one, boots crunching against the fractured ground. Their objective was a manufacturing complex that had once produced munitions for the entire sector. Now it was a husk of its former self, half collapsed and overrun with scavengers, and, rumour whispered, those who had turned from the Emperor's path. The colonel's mind raced through strategies, even as his body moved on autopilot. Every approach had consequences, every choice a weight on his conscience. He could not afford error, yet he could not ignore the humanity, or what faint semblance of it remained, in those who opposed him. The rival officer appeared alongside him again, moving with the same cold efficiency that had defined their every encounter. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. This operation would test not just their tactical skill, but their capacity to bear the cost of survival. The rival gestured toward a collapsed wall, forming a narrow alleyway leading to the manufacturum's central courtyard. "We breach there," he said, voice low through the respirator. "It will funnel them. Predictable, brutal, but effective." The colonel nodded once, signaling the platoons into position. Engineers readied demolition charges, while snipers and marksmen took vantage points among the skeletal remnants of the upper floors. The regiment moved in silence, each man a practiced extension of command. Silence was survival on Krieg. Noise drew death as easily as wind carried ash. The first contact was sudden. Figures leapt from the shadows of broken walls, heretics armed with scavenged laser guns and crude blades. The assault was swift, violent, and without hesitation. The colonel's men responded with disciplined precision, lasfire lancing the air, bayonets striking with lethal intent. The clash was brief, but ferocious. Every kill exacted its toll on the colonel's mind, a reminder that even in victory, nothing came without cost. Amid the chaos, the colonel noticed the rival struggling with a small detachment pinned behind a crumbled wall. Instinct battled with calculation. Divert and save them, or maintain the primary offensive to secure the manufacturum. Without hesitation, he pivoted, charging through the debris-strewn alley, rifle blazing, striking down the nearest threat. By the time he reached the rival, the squad was freed, though not without casualties. The colonel's chest ached, not from exertion, but from the familiar, gnawing awareness that every life preserved had been balanced against another lost. As the last defenders fell or fled into the dust-choked horizon, the colonel surveyed the courtyard. The manufacturum was theirs, its skeletal remains a testament to Krieg's unyielding advance. Yet the victory felt hollow. The machines within were long dead, the stocks of munitions scavenged or destroyed. The land remained scarred, the ghosts of industry and civilization whispering their absence in every broken wall and scorched floor. The rival approached, his movements precise, yet his presence carried a tension the colonel could not ignore. They were comrades in survival, but rivals in the silent reckoning of command. Each had saved the other countless times, yet every act of preservation was also a reminder of the fragility of their tenuous alliance. "The sector is cleared," the rival said, voice as flat as the horizon. "But it will not remain so. Others will come. Krieg never stays quiet for long." The colonel allowed himself a brief pause, taking in the desolation around him. He had followed orders, executed strategy, and survived the encounter. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than any weapon. Each decision, each sacrifice had its cost. The men behind him trusted him to navigate this world of death and ash. Yet he questioned whether even he could endure the endless balance of duty and conscience. Night fell quickly, swallowed by the thick smog that enveloped the sector. The colonel inspected the trench lines and positions his men for rest, though he knew sleep would be fleeting. He allowed himself a rare moment to look across the ruined courtyard, to wonder about the lives extinguished and the ones that remained only because he had chosen to act. On Krieg, survival was an unending trial, and the Emperor's judgment never slept. As the men settled into their positions, the colonel lingered at the edge of the trench, eyes scanning the darkened horizon. Somewhere beyond the ruins, more enemies awaited, and the march would continue at dawn. Yet in that quiet moment, amidst frost and ash, he allowed himself the smallest recognition of something dangerous. Hope. Not for peace, not for end, but for the certainty that, as long as they marched, Krieg's children endured. And that, on this cursed world, was all that mattered. The dawn broke over the poisoned plains of Krieg, like a dull coppered blade slicing through a veil of ash. The regiment stood ready in the trenches, the colonel at the forefront, scanning the horizon where ruined spires and fractured walls jutted into the smog-choked sky. The frost of night clung stubbornly to their greatcoats, and the cold wind cut through the respirators, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood and scorched earth. Beyond the visible ruins, he knew, enemies gathered, scavengers, heretics, and those who had once been children of Krieg, but had chosen defiance over duty. Orders came from the upper echelons of the Imperial Command, transmitted through the cumbersome comm arrays. A massive strike was to be launched to reclaim a network of supply bunkers several kilometers north, territory critical for the continuation of the relentless campaign. The colonel studied the maps, tracing the jagged routes through shell-pocked fields and collapsed manufactorums. The terrain itself was an enemy, shifting and unpredictable, each trench and crater a potential death trap. He felt the familiar weight pressing upon his shoulders, the knowledge that every decision would cost lives, and every hesitation could lead to failure. As the regiment moved forward, the rival officer appeared at the flank once more, his men forming a mirror of the colonel's precision. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden. Though their relationship had been forged in the crucible of endless combat, now it was tempered by the growing complexity of command. They were not merely soldiers leading men, but arbiters of survival, balancing duty and morality against the cold calculus of war. The first contact came without warning. Shadows moved along the shattered ridges of a collapsed manufactorum, and lasfire lanced through the haze, striking with lethal precision. The regiment responded immediately, their training flawless, but their minds burdened by the enormity of each life taken. The colonel moved among his men, issuing orders, stabilizing wavering squads, and anticipating the enemy's maneuvers. The battlefield was a living entity, shifting and unpredictable, and Krieg demanded that every breath be a calculated risk. In the midst of the fight, a larger threat revealed itself. A band of renegade Kriegborn, trained in the same techniques and discipline as the regiment, emerged from the shadows, striking with a brutality honed by years of exile and survival. They were mirror images of the colonel's own soldiers, familiar in stance and movement, yet entirely alien in intent. The clash was immediate, brutal, and personal. Every shot fired, every bayonet thrust, a confrontation not just with enemies, but with what the colonel might have been had he chosen a different path. The rival officer signaled a flanking maneuver, his troops advancing to envelop the renegades while the colonel led the main assault. The coordination between the two commands was instinctive, a testament to years of shared training and unspoken understanding. Yet the emotional tension undercut the tactical precision. Each kill was a reminder that even here, amidst victory, moral compromise was unavoidable. The colonel could not ignore the thought that every action preserved some, but condemned others. By midday, the enemy's resistance began to fracture. The colonel's forces pressed through the ruined manufactorum, capturing the supply bunkers, though not without cost. The ground was littered with bodies, friend and foe indistinguishable beneath layers of frost, dust, and ash. The rival officer approached him amid the chaos, his mask streaked with soot and sweat. "The sector is secured, but at a price," he said, voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet heavy with truth. "More will come. Krieg never yields." The colonel nodded, acknowledging both the tactical victory and the creeping awareness that every triumph was temporary. Even as they consolidated their positions, scouts reported distant movement, enemy regiments approaching, larger and better organized than any they had yet faced. The horizon seemed alive with shadow and threat, each distant figure a reminder that Krieg's war was endless, the front ever expanding and the price of survival ever higher. Night fell again, the weak glow of the dying sun swallowed by clouds of ash. The colonel walked among his men, checking positions, offering words of encouragement that felt hollow, even to him. Sleep would be brief. Exhaustion was a luxury none could afford. Yet even in the oppressive gloom, a subtle tension gripped him, a sense that the coming days would demand not only courage and discipline, but moral choices that could fracture loyalty and test the limits of duty. As he paused at the edge of the trench line, gazing across the ruined plains toward the dark horizon, he understood the truth that Krieg had always whispered but never shouted. The war was more than survival, more than obedience. It was a test of humanity itself, a measure of how far one would go to preserve life, exact revenge, and maintain honor in a world where honor was both shield and burden. The wind carried with it the faint echo of distant artillery, a reminder that tomorrow would demand the same relentless march, and that the shadow of death would never lift from their path. The pre-dawn haze clung to the landscape like a suffocating shroud, muted copper light barely illuminating the jagged ruins that scarred the plains of Krieg. The colonel moved among his regiment, every sense alert, each breath drawing in the bitter mix of frost, ash, and faint ozone from distant artillery strikes. The ground beneath their boots was uneven, pitted with craters, littered with shattered steel, and strewn with remnants of past battles that seemed eternal. Even here, the regiment moved as one, disciplined and unyielding, a river of greatcoats flowing through death and ruin. Orders had come through the comma rays in the dead of night. A larger enemy force, reinforced and better equipped, was advancing from the northern plateau. The report included scattered sightings of Krieg-born deserters, coordinating with heretic elements. Soldiers who had trained under the same doctrines, but had chosen betrayal over duty. The colonel considered the intelligence carefully. Each decision now carried heavier weight. To engage immediately could prevent the enemy from consolidating, but risked heavy losses. To delay would preserve lives, but might allow the enemy to entrench, making the eventual assault costlier. The rival officer appeared alongside him once more, his presence both a reassurance and a reminder of unspoken tension. Their eyes met briefly, acknowledging the inevitability of the confrontation. Neither spoke, yet both understood the calculus of command. In the trenches of Krieg, survival demanded both precision and ruthlessness, and personal sentiment could be fatal. The first contact came in the mid-morning haze. Scouts reported a movement along a ridge. Figures glimpsed through the drifting smoke of distant artillery. Las fire streaked across the ruined terrain, cutting down the first wave of attackers before they could close. But this was only a probing force, testing the regiment's positions. The colonel signaled his men to hold their ground, consolidating the line, watching, calculating. As the day progressed, the enemy began a coordinated assault. From the northern plateau, they descended in waves, not mindless scavengers or isolated heretics, but disciplined soldiers employing tactics that mirrored Kriegborn training. The battle quickly escalated, the trenches erupting with fire, smoke, and the cries of the wounded. The colonel moved among his men, issuing orders with calm authority, adjusting strategies in real time as the enemy's formations shifted. Every choice meant life or death. Every hesitation could be fatal. Amid the chaos, the colonel noticed a squad of enemy troops attempting a flanking maneuver, moving through a narrow alley that could bypass the regiment's defenses. He debated for a moment: divert forces and risk weakening the main line, or ignore the flank and risk encirclement. Decision made, he led a detachment personally, cutting through the smoke with precision and ferocity. By the time they engaged, the enemy squad was caught off guard, their cohesion shattered. Yet even in victory, casualties mounted, and the colonel felt the familiar pang of guilt. Each life lost a reminder that obedience and discipline did not absolve responsibility. The rival officer, coordinating his own forces on the opposite flank, signaled with subtle gestures, and the two movements converged seamlessly. Their coordination was instinctive, a testament to years of shared experience. But it carried an undercurrent of tension. They trusted each other in the execution of strategy, yet neither fully trusted the other's moral compass. Survival required unity, but their silent rivalry persisted, a constant reminder of the thin line between cooperation and conflict. By late afternoon, the enemy began to falter, their waves breaking against the disciplined wall of the regiment. Yet the battle was far from over. Scouts reported that the enemy had withdrawn only temporarily, regrouping behind ruined manufactorums to strike again with renewed strength. The colonel understood the warning. This was a test not just of firepower, but of endurance, judgment, and the psychological resilience of every man under his command. As night fell, the colonel walked along the trench line, observing his men as they tended to the wounded, reinforced positions and prepared for the next assault. The sky above was a muted canvas, streaked with ash, the faint glow of distant fires painting an eerie light over the battlefield. The weight of command pressed heavily upon him, compounded by the knowledge that tomorrow's engagement would demand more precision, more sacrifice, and more moral reckoning. He paused at the edge of the trench, looking across the frozen plains toward the enemy's suspected positions. Somewhere in that darkness, lives hung in the balance, and every decision he had made and would make could tip that balance toward survival or annihilation. In the silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant echoes of artillery, he realized the truth that Krieg always whispered. On this world, victory was never permanent. Loyalty was tested constantly, and even the most disciplined soldier could falter under the weight of endless war. The frost-bitten dawn revealed a landscape even more scarred than the day before, a lattice of shattered manufactorums, cratered plains, and collapsed fortifications, stretching toward a horizon swallowed by ash and smoke. The regiment moved through the wasteland, like shadows of inevitability, disciplined, silent, their respirators filtering the bitter air, while the colonel observed every step with the unwavering scrutiny of a man who had learned the cost of hesitation. Krieg had taught them that indecision was death, and that discipline alone was insufficient without foresight. The enemy had returned in force overnight, their advance more organized, their tactics more precise. Scouts reported not only Krieg-born deserters, but also alien mercenaries and heretics, united in a deadly coalition against the regiment. The colonel studied the maps, tracing possible approaches, predicting the enemy's maneuvers with the cold calculations of experience. Each route carried risk, every decision could be fatal, and yet there was no alternative. To retreat was unthinkable. To hesitate was to invite annihilation. The rival officer appeared at the northern flank, his movements precise, almost mechanical, yet charged with unspoken tension. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they shared and the precarious alliance between them. Both understood the delicate calculus of command. Their lives were entwined with the lives of the men under them, and yet their paths could diverge with the slightest misstep. Mutual respect existed, but it was always tempered by the subtle undercurrent of rivalry and the unvoiced question of judgment. The first engagement erupted mid-morning. From the shattered ridgelines, enemy volleys of last fire lanced through the air, striking with precision at the forefront of the regiment. The soldiers responded with disciplined accuracy. Every shot, every bayonet, thrust a manifestation of training, honed through decades of conflict. The colonel moved along the lines, issuing orders, stabilizing wavering squads, and coordinating counter-assaults with meticulous efficiency. Death was ever present, and each loss was recorded not only in body count, but in the quiet tally of human cost that weighed on every commander's conscience. Amid the fury of battle, the colonel noticed a small contingent of enemy troops attempting to breach the trenches near the eastern approach. They were skilled, moving with a disciplined aggression that mirrored Krieg-born tactics. The colonel faced a critical choice: divert forces to intercept the flanking squad, risking the integrity of the central line, or hold position and rely on sheer defensive strength. Without hesitation, he led a detachment through the frozen mud, engaging the enemy with both precision and ferocity. The skirmish was brutal but brief. The flanking squad was neutralized, yet the casualties among his own men were a stark reminder of the relentless cost of command. The rival officer coordinated his own maneuver simultaneously, sending his units to envelop enemy forces, attempting to flank the colonel's detachment. Their silent synchronization was flawless, a testament to the years of shared training. Yet the emotional strain was unmistakable. Each had saved the other countless times, yet each understood that loyalty and survival were not synonymous. Every action was a gamble with lives balanced on the edge of judgment and instinct. By midday, the enemy began to falter, their attacks becoming fragmented and desperate. The colonel pressed the advantage, leading small, precise assaults into pockets of resistance while reinforcing the line where vulnerability appeared. The regiment moved as one, disciplined and relentless, a testament to the unyielding rigor of Krieg's training. Yet even in the midst of tactical success, the colonel felt the gnawing weight of responsibility. Victory was not measured in bodies vanquished alone, but in the preservation of what remained, the maintenance of order in a world that thrived on chaos. Nightfall brought a fragile calm, the battlefield quiet except for the distant groan of collapsing structures and the occasional echo of artillery. The colonel walked along the trench line, inspecting the men, checking positions, and offering words of encouragement that were at once genuine and hollow. Sleep would be brief, and the next day would demand renewed vigilance. But for now, the regiment held, and that was enough. He paused at the edge of the trench, gazing across the cratered plains at the smouldering remnants of manufactorums and shattered battlements. Somewhere beyond the darkness, enemies stirred, waiting to test the regiment once more. The colonel adjusted his grip on his rifle, feeling the familiar, relentless weight of command pressing down upon him. On Krieg, survival was never guaranteed, and even the most disciplined forces could be tested beyond endurance. Yet in that moment, amidst frost and ruin, he felt the faintest acknowledgement of resolve. As long as they marched, Krieg's children endured, and that alone was a defiance against a universe that had long since forgotten mercy. The cold light of dawn revealed a landscape of devastation, stretching as far as the eye could see. Craters yawned across the plains, like the hollowed eyes of the dead, and the skeletal remains of manufactorums jutted into the ash-choked sky, their jagged edges a testament to centuries of relentless warfare. The colonel moved among his regiment, each step measured, each glance deliberate. His eyes swept the horizon, noting every ridge, every ruined wall, every potential vantage point that could spell life or death. Krieg had taught them that survival was not chance but discipline, foresight, and the willingness to sacrifice all for the Emperor's will. Reports from scouts had confirmed troubling intelligence. A coalition of heretics, deserters, and alien mercenaries had consolidated their positions to the north, preparing for a coordinated assault. The scale of the threat was unlike any the regiment had faced before, and the colonel understood that every decision from this moment would be magnified in consequence. He gathered the officers, laying out a plan that balanced aggression with caution, forward movement with defense, and strict adherence to discipline with the flexibility demanded by the unpredictable terrain. The rival officer stood beside him, silent but alert. Their past encounters had forged a relationship of mutual recognition, tempered by rivalry and the unspoken awareness that only the most rigorous command could preserve life in such relentless conditions. The colonel met his gaze briefly, understanding that the coming engagement would test not only tactics, but the limits of loyalty, judgment, and endurance. As the morning wore on, the enemy launched their first coordinated strike. From the northern plateau, waves of attackers advanced across the frozen wasteland, disciplined in movement and precise in execution. Lassfire lanced the air, striking with deadly accuracy, while the colonel's regiment responded in kind, maintaining cohesion despite the chaos. He moved along the front lines, issuing commands, stabilizing faltering squads, and observing the ebb and flow of combat with a calculating eye. Each life lost weighed upon him, a grim ledger of responsibility that no medal or commendation could erase. Amid the fury of battle, the colonel noticed a group of enemy forces attempting a flanking maneuver through a narrow ravine to the east. The choice was immediate and unforgiving: divert forces to intercept them and risk weakening the main line, or maintain the central assault and gamble that the flanking squad would be contained. Without hesitation, he led a detachment himself, cutting through the smoke and ash with precision and ferocity. The skirmish was brutal and casualties were high, yet the flanking threat was neutralized, preserving the integrity of the regiment's primary position. The rival officer executed a simultaneous maneuver on the opposite flank, and the two movements converged seamlessly. Their coordination was flawless, born of experience and instinct, yet the emotional strain was palpable. Each had saved the other countless times, yet every act of preservation carried with it the unspoken cost of responsibility, a reminder that loyalty was inseparable from sacrifice. By afternoon, the enemy's formation began to falter. The colonel pressed the advantage, leading assaults into weak points, reinforcing the trenches where vulnerability appeared, and methodically driving the opposition back toward the northern ridges. Yet even as the tide of battle shifted in their favor, the colonel felt the gnawing weight of inevitability. Each victory was temporary, each advance exacted a toll, and the battlefield was an unforgiving ledger that demanded payment in blood and endurance. As night fell, the regiment consolidated its positions. The trenches were reinforced, the wounded tended to, and defensive positions prepared for the inevitable return of the enemy. The colonel walked the line, inspecting his men, offering words of encouragement tempered by the knowledge that any moment could bring death or despair. The wind carried the faint echoes of distant artillery, a reminder that the war extended far beyond their immediate sector, and that survival was both discipline and defiance against an uncaring universe. Pausing at the edge of the trench, the colonel looked across the scarred plains, the skeletal remains of manufactorums silhouetted against a sky thick with smoke and ash. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy forces gathered, awaiting the dawn and the next engagement. His mind weighed strategy, morality, and the unrelenting calculus of command. On Krieg, survival was not a gift, but a relentless obligation, and every choice, every sacrifice, carried the weight of consequence. Yet in the shadow of despair, the colonel felt a quiet, resolute acknowledgement. As long as the regiment marched, Krieg endured, and with it, the unbroken will of the Emperor's children. The morning haze clung to the ruins like a shroud of smoke and frost, the cold air biting through respirators and greatcoats alike. The regiment had spent the night consolidating its positions, tending to the wounded, and reinforcing the trenches with whatever scrap and steel could be found amid the devastation. The colonel moved along the lines, inspecting every emplacement, every squad, his eyes catching the smallest shift in posture or weapon alignment. Krieg demanded vigilance even in the briefest reprieve. Survival was earned through unbroken discipline, and any lapse could be fatal. Reports from scouts confirmed what the colonel had feared. The enemy had regrouped on the northern plateau, their numbers augmented by alien mercenaries and heretic Krieg-born deserters. They were no longer fragmented bands or isolated raiding parties. They were a coordinated force with a single, clear objective: to crush the regiment and seize control of the sector. The colonel gathered his officers, maps spread across a makeshift table of shattered metal and stone. Each line traced, each position considered, reflected the delicate balance between aggression and preservation, between obedience and the exercise of personal judgment in the heat of command. The rival officer stood at his side, surveying the plans with a practiced eye. Their interactions had grown from cautious recognition to a partnership forged in the crucible of combat. Yet tension lingered beneath the surface. Every maneuver executed, every command given, carried with it the silent question of loyalty. How far could trust endure in the unending calculus of life and death? The colonel met his gaze briefly, acknowledging the unspoken agreement that both their fates were intertwined with the men under them. Yet neither could fully gauge the other's internal compass. By mid-morning, the first enemy probes advanced through the cratered plains. Lasfire lanced the haze, and the regiment responded with disciplined precision. The colonel moved along the front, issuing orders, coordinating squads, and assessing the enemy's patterns. Every action required both strategy and conscience. Every casualty weighed upon him as a ledger of responsibility he could neither dismiss nor absolve. As the engagement intensified, the colonel noticed a contingent of enemy troops attempting a stealthy flanking maneuver through a narrow ravine to the east. A decision had to be made instantly. redirect forces to intercept and risk weakening the main assault line, or hold position and gamble that the flank would fail. Without hesitation, the colonel led a detachment personally, moving through the smoke and frost with calculated ferocity. The skirmish was violent and swift. The enemy flank was neutralized, but not without cost. Every loss carved itself into the colonel's consciousness, a reminder that even the most disciplined troops could not escape the moral weight of war. The rival officer simultaneously executed a flanking maneuver on the opposite side, their actions converging with near-perfect coordination. The colonel noted the quiet strain in the officer's posture, a subtle acknowledgement that trust was forged under fire, but never free of tension. They were allies, yes, but the imperatives of command, survival, loyalty, obedience, were a constant test of both friendship and judgment. By late afternoon, the enemy began to fracture under the relentless pressure. The colonel ordered assaults into weak points, reinforced vulnerable trenches, and systematically drove the opposition back toward the northern ridges. Yet with each advance came the gnawing awareness of inevitable cost. The battlefield was an unforgiving ledger, exacting payment in blood, endurance, and the quiet erosion of morality. As night fell, the colonel walked the line, inspecting the trenches, checking positions, and offering words of encouragement tempered by the bitter reality of loss. The faint glow of distant fires and the muffled rumble of artillery carried across the plains, a reminder that their struggle was only a fraction of a far larger conflict. On Krieg, survival was never granted, only earned through discipline, sacrifice, and the unyielding execution of duty. Pausing at the edge of the trench, the colonel surveyed the horizon, skeletal manufactorums silhouetted against a sky heavy with smoke. Somewhere beyond the darkness, enemies were regrouping, waiting for the dawn, the next clash, the next calculation of life against necessity. The weight of command pressed unrelentingly upon him, yet amidst the ash and frost, he recognized a fragile, resolute truth. As long as the regiment marched, Krieg endured, and with it, the unbroken will of the Emperor's children. The first light of dawn struggled through a sky thick with ash and smoke, casting the ruined plains of Krieg in a pallid, sickly glow. The regiment moved with precision along the trench lines, boots crunching against frost-laden rubble, respirators hissing with each measured breath. The colonel's eyes swept the shattered horizon, noting every ridge, crater, and skeletal manufactorum that could conceal threats both seen and unseen. Krieg had taught them that survival was a matter of foresight and discipline. Yet each step forward was a reminder that even the most ordered mind could not anticipate all the horrors of war. Intelligence reports confirmed the rumors whispered by scouts. The enemy had regrouped, consolidating deserters, heretics, and alien mercenaries into a formidable force. They were disciplined, coordinated, and ruthless, a mirror of Krieg-born tactics now turned against the regiment itself. The colonel summoned his officers, maps spread across a makeshift table of shattered metal and stone. Each line, each position was scrutinized, every possible movement weighed for both tactical efficacy and the moral consequences of lives inevitably lost. The rival officer appeared at the edge of the command table, silent but watchful. Their alliance, forged in the crucible of previous engagements, had grown into a complex partnership tinged with tension. Trust existed, but it was fragile, built on necessity and experience rather than sentiment. Each decision now would test not only strategy, but the hidden moral compass guiding each leader. By mid-morning, the first enemy probes advanced through the cratered fields. Las fire streaked through the frost-choked air, met instantly by disciplined volleys from the regiment. The colonel moved among the squads, issuing precise orders, stabilizing wavering units, and anticipating the enemy's tactics. Each life lost was a reminder that survival came at a relentless cost, and even victory carried the shadow of guilt. The battle intensified when the colonel observed a coordinated flanking maneuver by enemy forces along a ravine to the east. The choice was immediate and unforgiving: divert forces to intercept and risk weakening the main line, or hold position and hope the flank failed. Without hesitation, he led a detachment personally, cutting through smoke, frost, and debris with lethal efficiency. The engagement was swift and brutal. The enemy flank was neutralized, but casualties were heavy, a bitter testament to the merciless arithmetic of war. Simultaneously, the rival officer executed a maneuver on the western flank, their movements converging flawlessly. Coordination was instinctive, honed over countless battles, yet the emotional weight of command was palpable. Each had preserved the other's men countless times, yet loyalty was inseparable from moral responsibility, and every action exacted its toll. By afternoon, the enemy's formation began to falter. The colonel pressed the advantage, leading precise assaults into weak points, reinforcing vulnerable trenches, and systematically driving the opposition toward the northern ridges. Victory came in measured increments, each one shadowed by the unyielding knowledge that every decision cost lives, and that the battlefield was an unrelenting arbiter of morality and necessity. Night fell, and the regiment consolidated its positions, tending to the wounded and fortifying defenses. The colonel walked the trench line, offering words of encouragement, tempered by the knowledge that the enemy would return with greater force. The distant echo of artillery and the faint glow of fires on the horizon were constant reminders that this sector was but a single node in a sprawling, merciless war. Pausing at the edge of the trench, the colonel surveyed the devastated plains. The skeletal ruins of manufactorums rose like silent witnesses to countless battles, their jagged forms etched against the smoke-filled sky. Somewhere beyond the darkness, enemies gathered, plotting the next attack. The weight of command pressed upon him with unrelenting force, yet amidst the ash and frost, a quiet resolve settled within. As long as the regiment marched, Krieg endured, and with it, the unbroken will of the Emperor's children, a testament to discipline, sacrifice, and unyielding loyalty in a galaxy of ceaseless war. The sky above Krieg had darkened into a bruised tapestry of ash and smoke, the sun a pale, dying eye behind a veil of clouds. The regiment's trenches lay silent, save for the distant echo of artillery and the occasional hiss of a respirator. The colonel moved along the lines, inspecting positions and observing his men, their faces etched with exhaustion, determination, and the quiet resignation that came with the realization that survival was never guaranteed. Each soldier carried the weight of discipline, duty, and the unspoken cost of obedience. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The enemy had consolidated, forming a force larger and more coordinated than ever before. The northern plateau, previously a fractured expanse of ridges and ruins, now hosted entrenched formations, heretic Krieg-born deserters, and mercenaries trained in methods that mirrored the regiment's own. The threat was no longer merely physical, it was psychological, a reflection of the colonel's own teachings turned against him. He gathered his officers, maps spread across a battered table, each line traced and traced again, every possible maneuver weighed for both tactical success and moral consequence. The rival officer stood nearby, silent, his presence a reminder of both alliance and unspoken tension. Years of cooperation had forged a bond tempered by mutual respect, yet each command carried with it the constant question of loyalty and judgment. They were allies, yes, But survival demanded scrutiny, and trust was always tested under fire. By mid-morning, the enemy launched their first coordinated strike. Lasfire streaked across the frozen plains, and the regiment responded with disciplined precision. The colonel moved among his men, issuing orders, stabilizing faltering squads, and anticipating enemy movements with a keen, calculating mind. Every life lost was a shadow on his conscience, each victory a hollow echo of survival's cost. A critical threat soon emerged. A large contingent of enemy forces attempted a flanking maneuver through a narrow ravine to the east. The colonel faced an immediate and unforgiving choice: divert forces to intercept the flank and risk weakening the main line, or hold position and gamble that the enemy would fail. Without hesitation, he led a detachment personally, cutting through smoke, frost, and debris with lethal efficiency. The skirmish was violent and casualties were heavy, yet the flank was neutralized, preserving the regiment's central position. Simultaneously, the rival officer executed a maneuver on the western approach, their movements converging with near-perfect coordination. The synchronization was instinctive, yet beneath the surface lay a strain of moral tension. Each had saved the other countless times, but every act of preservation was inseparable from the ethical burden of command. Loyalty and duty were measured in lives, and the colonel understood that survival alone did not absolve the cost. By late afternoon, the enemy began to fracture under relentless pressure. The colonel ordered assaults into weak points, reinforced vulnerable trenches, and drove the opposition toward the northern ridges. Yet with each advance came the gnawing knowledge that every decision exacted its price. The battlefield was unforgiving, a relentless judge of morality, strategy, and human endurance. As night fell, the regiment consolidated its positions, tending to the wounded, fortifying defenses, and preparing for the inevitable continuation of the enemy's assault. The colonel walked the trench line, offering words of encouragement tempered by the reality of loss, his mind heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow would demand more precision, more sacrifice, and more moral reckoning. Pausing at the edge of the trench, the colonel surveyed the devastated plains. The skeletal remains of manufactorums rose like silent witnesses, jagged against the smoke-filled sky. Somewhere beyond the darkness, enemies plotted the next move, and the weight of command pressed unrelentingly upon him. Yet amid the ash and frost, he felt a quiet, resolute understanding. As long as the regiment marched, Krieg endured, and with it, the unbroken will of the Emperor's children, forged in discipline, tempered by sacrifice, and tested endlessly by the merciless calculus of war. The sky above Krieg was a bruised expanse of ash and smoke, heavy with the scent of burning metal and frozen earth. The regiment had spent the night preparing, reinforcing trenches, tending to the wounded, and readying every man for the inevitable onslaught. The colonel moved among his soldiers, his eyes sharp, noting every line of fatigue, every tense posture, every subtle indication of doubt or fear. Krieg demanded more than obedience. It demanded resilience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance that death was never far behind. Intelligence reports confirmed the worst fears. The enemy had gathered their full strength, combining heretic Krieg-born deserters, mercenary forces, and alien auxiliaries into a single, formidable army. Their positions were entrenched along the northern ridges, their movements precise, their tactics designed to exploit any weakness. The colonel studied the maps, tracing possible assaults and countermaneuvers, calculating every risk with the cold efficiency born of decades of experience. Every decision carried the weight of countless lives. Hesitation could mean annihilation. The rival officer approached silently, surveying the battlefield with the same keen eye the colonel had come to expect. Years of cooperation had forged an alliance tempered by respect. Yet under the surface lay an ever-present tension. Trust was necessary, yet fragile. Every command carried with it the unspoken question of loyalty, judgment, and the moral cost of survival. The colonel met his gaze briefly, acknowledging the silent understanding that the trials of today would test not only strategy, but the very fabric of conscience. As dawn broke, the enemy launched their first wave of coordinated attacks. Lasfire streaked across the frozen plains, cutting down the vanguard of the regiment. The colonel moved along the front, issuing orders, stabilizing faltering squads, and adjusting tactics in real time as enemy formations shifted and adapted. Each decision was a balance of necessity and morality. Every casualty a reminder that survival demanded both ruthlessness and restraint. A critical threat soon emerged. A concentrated flanking maneuver through a ravine to the east threatened to collapse the regiment's line. The colonel had only moments to decide: divert forces to intercept the flank and risk weakening the center, or hold position and gamble that the enemy would fail. He chose action, leading a detachment personally into the fray. Smoke, frost, and the thunder of Lasfire enveloped them, each step a calculated risk. The skirmish was brutal, casualties were high, yet the flank was neutralized, preserving the regiment's central position. Simultaneously, the rival officer executed a maneuver on the western flank. Their movements converged with almost preternatural coordination, a testament to shared experience and instinct. Yet beneath the precision lay a deeper tension. Each act of preservation carried moral weight, and loyalty was inseparable from the cost exacted in blood. Survival alone could not absolve the burden of command. By mid-afternoon, the enemy began to fracture under relentless pressure. The colonel pressed the advantage, leading precise assaults into weak points, reinforcing vulnerable trenches and driving the opposition toward the northern ridges. The battlefield was a crucible, testing both strategy and conscience. Every decision etched with the potential for irreversible consequence. As dusk fell, the regiment held its lines, though exhaustion and loss weighed heavily on every man. The colonel walked among them, offering words tempered with the reality of war. Survival was measured not in victory alone, but in the perseverance of discipline, the endurance of loyalty, and the willingness to bear the unrelenting moral burden of command. Pausing at the edge of the trench, the colonel surveyed the shattered plains. The skeletal remains of manufactorums rose like silent witnesses to centuries of conflict, jagged against a sky suffused with smoke and the dying light of day. Somewhere beyond the darkness, enemies gathered, plotting the next move, and the weight of command pressed unyieldingly upon him. Amid the ash and frost, he felt a quiet, resolute truth. As long as the regiment marched, Krieg endured, and with it, the unbroken will of the Emperor's children, forged in discipline, tempered by sacrifice, and tested endlessly by the merciless calculus of war. The sky over Krieg was a muted grey, a canvas of ash and smoke that seemed to stretch infinitely across the scarred plains. The battlefield, littered with the remnants of shattered manufactorums and frozen craters, was silent save for the distant groan of collapsing structures and the faint hiss of respirators. The regiment moved with deliberate precision, each soldier a testament to unbroken discipline. Yet each step carried the weight of exhaustion, grief, and the relentless knowledge that survival had never been guaranteed. The colonel walked along the trench line, observing his men with a keen, deliberate eye. Years of service had taught him that command was not only about strategy or tactics, but about the moral and psychological endurance of those under him. Every decision he had made, every maneuver executed, every life spared or lost had brought them to this moment, the culmination of endless sacrifice and unrelenting duty. His heart bore the quiet weight of countless losses, the unspoken toll of command that no medal, commendation, or honor could ever absolve. Reports confirmed the final enemy movements: heretic, Krieg-born deserters, alien mercenaries, and renegade human elements were massing for a last, decisive assault on the northern ridges. Their intent was clear: to break the regiment, to claim victory at any cost. The colonel studied the maps, calculating every possibility, yet he understood the grim truth: no plan, no calculation could entirely mitigate the human cost of the coming storm. Every decision would demand sacrifice. Every order would carve its mark upon both the living and the dead. As the first wave descended, lasfire streaked across the sky, illuminating the frozen battlefield with harsh, brief flashes. The regiment responded with disciplined, lethal precision, forming an unbroken wall of steel, fire, and determination. The colonel moved among the lines, issuing orders, stabilizing faltering squads, and adjusting tactics in real time. Each choice was measured, deliberate, yet every casualty whispered the eternal truth of Krieg. Discipline alone could not erase the cost of survival. A critical flank emerged, threatening the integrity of the regiment's line. The colonel faced the ultimate test: to divert forces and risk weakening the center, or to hold position and gamble that the enemy would fail. With decisive resolve, he led a detachment personally into the fray. Smoke, ash, and fire enveloped them as the clash unfolded, each movement a calculated risk, each breath a reminder of mortality and the inexorable weight of duty. The engagement was brutal. Men fell, enemies were cut down, and the ground became a testament to both valor and loss. Simultaneously, the rival officer maneuvered on the opposite flank. Their coordination, honed by years of shared battles, was precise, yet under the surface lay the deepest moral tension. Loyalty, duty, and survival were inseparable, yet every act of preservation exacted its toll. The colonel felt the gnawing truth that even victory carried the weight of consequence, that discipline, courage, and obedience could never absolve the human cost of endless war. By evening, the enemy's lines finally broke. The regiment had held, the northern ridges secured, yet the victory was shadowed by exhaustion, loss, and the relentless awareness of the price paid. The colonel walked among the survivors, inspecting the trenches, offering words of grim reassurance, yet knowing that the true reckoning would come in reflection, in the quiet moments after battle, when the echo of the fallen spoke louder than any artillery. Pausing at the edge of the trench, he gazed across the frozen, shattered plains. The skeletal remains of manufactorums stood like silent sentinels, jagged monuments to centuries of warfare and sacrifice. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemies still stirred, yet for this moment, Krieg endured. The colonel felt the profound weight of command settle upon him. The burden of survival, the cost of discipline, and the inescapable truth that immortality, for those who survived, came with the unending witness to destruction, the endless tally of lives preserved and lost, and the quiet knowledge that no era of triumph could erase the shadow of sacrifice. In that frozen silence, amidst ash, frost, and ruin, he understood the ultimate truth of Krieg. Victory was never absolute. Loyalty was always tested, and the unbroken will of the Emperor's children endured not through glory, but through relentless perseverance, sacrifice, and the quiet acknowledgement of mortality within immortality. The battlefield was still, yet alive with memory, loss, and the unyielding testament to those who had given everything for duty honor, and survival. The colonel turned his gaze toward the distant horizon, knowing that even as this battle ended, the war would continue. Yet for now, Krieg stood unbroken, and within its frozen trenches, the enduring spirit of the regiment whispered the truth of their existence. They were forged for the trenches, born for sacrifice, and defined by the unrelenting discipline that kept the galaxy's darkest horrors at bay.